Marhaba. I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce Chibli Mallat. He's known to many of you. He's a lawyer, a law professor. He's taught in many universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton. He holds a chair at Saint Joseph University, Jean Monnet chair. But also he's remembered in Lebanon for having been a different kind of politician. He has tried to infuse in the presidential campaign in the year 2005, 6, a new set of values, a different way of engaging in politics. He's also remembered in the eyes of many for the famous court case against Ariel Sharon in Belgium. He's an academic, but is a public intellectual. And he has had many contributions to the most timely debates of the Arab world and the region. He knows Iraq extremely well. He's written about Iraq. And he's just published a book that is not just one of those thick academic books, but it's a book that addresses very, very timely issues. About violence, it's about constitutionalism, it's about transition. I've had recently a conversation with Chibli about transition. He's very critical of the transitology that political theorists in the West, the United States more particularly, have developed as they advised us on how to steer transition towards democracy in post-conflict situations. So on all these subjects, I'm sure Chibli has a lot to say. I don't know how much he will cover in this lecture of his. He said he would need half an hour to 40 minutes. Then we will have discussion, and he will be happy to sign his book for those of you who would like to go back home with a good food for this weekend's thought.
Thank you, Dr. Mtri. It's symbolically a great pleasure to be with you, and I enjoying this pleasure doubly. Not so much because it's Friday, the 13th of February, but because there's a combination of the first year of Tariq Mitri in this very remarkable institution, and AUB, of course, for all of us, is the substratum of nonviolence that we find a haven into. So this combination is very special, and I thank you for taking the time today at an undue hour with this weather to come and discuss this book with me. It's always a great relief to finish a book. Part of the relief is that you don't want to write lectures again. And so I'm going to foist upon you a sort of a mixture of the main thesis of the book, which I summarize at various parts so as to remind the reader that there is some coherence in this work. But also, I would like to then be a bit more specific in terms of the theme of our lecture, which is this to and fro between the local Middle Eastern Arab and the more universal ambition that the book has to map out a serious philosophy of nonviolence. And while I hope the book is timely, it's difficult. In the Middle East, I think the book would have been timely at least for the past 100 years, considering the amount of violence there is in the region. But I do hope, and it's the ambition of the book, fortunately I won't be here to assess it, that long after I will have departed, there will be still some value to the book as an attempt to think philosophically over the topic of revolution, constitutionalism, and justice in one coherent whole that ends or diminishes the use of violence to advance one's interest when one is in political life with political ambitions, whether it is in the shape of international wars or whether it is in the use of violence domestically to advance one's benefits. So then first, if you would, let me read to you a part of the book which summarizes some of the most distinct features of it. And then we can perhaps transition, the word that I can use in this context, to something a bit more specific that relates to the title and your interests in the more regional, local dimension of the work. If nonviolence is the central philosophy of the Middle East revolution in world historic terms, let me restate the thesis of the book in the light of conclusions reached in the journey. There are, in my view of a coherent philosophy of nonviolence, three moments. One is the revolutionary moment, one is the constitutional moment, and one is the justice or judicial moment, understood as the accountability of former dictators and their mostly top aides. The first moment of the eruption of nonviolence as the nexus of a philosophy of history came from the massive march of people across the Middle East in 2011, following the unsuccessful Cedar and Green nonviolent revolutions in Beirut and Tehran in 2005 and in 2009. Nonviolence in absolute is possible during the revolution, the new Middle Eastern reality decreed. In Lebanon in 2005-06, in Iran in 2009, in Tunisia and Egypt in January, February 2011, in Bahrain since 2011, in Yemen since February 2011 until the Houthi movement this summer, and in Syria from March 2011 to the militarization of the revolution in the summer of that year. All of these I call decrees of reality that the Middle East has forced onto a world historic scene. Such characteristically nonviolent revolutions have also been in evidence in practically all other countries where massive popular resistance in the shape of widespread demonstrations took place, including Oman, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Jordan, Algeria, and Sudan, as well as Turkey and Israel against a different background of authoritarianism. The upshot is clear. Not a single security agent, however brutal, needs to be killed or physically harmed by the revolution. Conversely, the security apparatus of the dictatorship thrives on violence, a premise without which the revolution cannot be nonviolent in the first place. Violence defines dictatorship, against which the Enlightenment and the Middle Eastern classical tradition allow and sometimes encourage the armed rise of the oppressed citizens against their tyrannical ruler. The right to take up arms against tyranny makes the choice to pursue nonviolence a paradigmatic change in the philosophy of history. Coming in the tracks of other such world historic moments, ending the Soviet system in Russia and Eastern Europe in 1989-1990, mostly by nonviolent means, the Middle East revolution anchors nonviolence further at the heart of a novel philosophy of history. The revolution can be nonviolent so long as the dictator is in place. Absolute nonviolence is bound in time by the dictator's survival in power. Once the dictator is removed, the constitutional moment starts where legitimate coercion through a fair legal process becomes necessary within the monopoly of violence that the government, qua state, exercises. To uphold the rule of law, the state cannot function without the monopoly of violence, in Max Weber's celebrated aphorism, or in perhaps less known to you, Robert Cover, a great jurist from Yale who died in 1986, in his elegant phrase, a state cannot function without judges dealing pain and death every day. As the objective of the revolution is to replace the dictator's arbitrary rule by a system of government ruled by law, the successful revolution is bound to redefine the social contract in terms of human rights and democratic constitutionalism against the defeated dictatorship. Until the revolution succeeds, that is, until it captures the government, the revolution can be nonviolent, absolutely so. After that, the use of violence by the government is back as the norm, this time in a set of constraints we call democratic because they involve a tangible measure of choice by the people of their representatives, and because the rule of law provides the citizen with basic rights, including the right to change the ruler at the helm, in a way that makes a new revolution unnecessary in the first place. This paradox, that is the paradox of a revolution that can be absolutely nonviolent, and the constitutional moment, which has to rely on an element of violence that we associate with the rule of law, this paradox is at its strongest. The paradox at its strongest is that the government, even a democratic government, is violent by legal monopoly, and that the revolution is and has been nonviolent in the absolute. That is, until the revolution captures it from the dictator. After that, it has no choice. It must convey violence through the rule of law, represented metaphorically by a working constitution and by the judge who ultimately protects social peace with the assistance of the government's coercive force. This paradox, described in Kant's cover juxtaposition in a chapter of the book, so a juxtaposition that I make between Kant's perpetual peace and Cover's powerful Weberian remark that domestic peace is always violent, even in a democratic government. This paradox of a perpetual peace between participant countries that are violent domestically is solved by a temporal conception of the revolution. If, in order to succeed, the nonviolent revolution has an inevitable objective, namely to capture the state and produce a government that is perforce violent, then even its absolute nonviolence needs to be qualified in time. The revolution can remain absolutely pristinely nonviolent as it unfolds towards the deposition of the dictator. But the revolution cannot be permanent, as it inevitably seeks to anchor its success in a constitutional moment, delivering a government of its own. Without such government, we have secession, anarchy, or jacquerie, all unsustainable disorders, and each commanding its own more or less severe dose of violence. The stated and clear objective of the new social contract in the nonviolent revolution includes the protection of the people's basic rights as well as their individual and collective right to remove the government in regular free elections or indeed in renewed peaceful nonviolent marches. Successful revolution wants liberty and security for the citizen, which is never offered by dictatorship. This is why its constitutional moment is so important. In time, the successful revolution reestablishes judges who deal pain and death. But there is also a difference in nature. In a revolution, the arbitrary law of the dictatorial state is defied in its essence. Dictatorial law is an oxymoron, and the revolution exposes its transmogrifying arbitrariness. There is no law left to obey during the revolution, as there is no legitimacy in the dictator or any of his acts. Law in a dictatorship is a monster, Nietzsche's Ungeheuer. In the state post-dictatorship, the law recovers its legitimate monopoly over violence expressed in the constitution and derivative legislation and in a working judiciary. By nature, a nonviolent revolution is at one with the expectation of a democratic constitution. Taking over the government is the revolution's main objective, first formulated in the negative. The people want to bring down the despot. The nonviolent revolution knows perfectly well that violence will soon return in the state monopoly over it, consensually channeled in a procedure that is called democracy, good governance, free and fair elections, transparency and accountability, an independent court system. All of these expressions of a system in which massive active consent is so dominant and effective as to make law-breaking a punishable behavior by the agents of the government under the control of an impartial judiciary, also known as rule of law. The part and parcel of the philosophy of nonviolence is, therefore, the rule of law as the constitutional moment of the 2011 revolution. When society, freed from the dictator, focuses its energy on rewriting the social contract in a constitution, thereby institutionalizing nonviolence as a way for the citizens to compete for political power without shedding blood. The constitutional process is never linear, and the Middle East revolution is complicated by the many countries that are part of it, each with its own rhythm and idiosyncrasies, each looking over the borders to see how political trends, elections, and constitution making are proceeding and receding elsewhere, and each traversed by the world historic moment unleashed in 2011. Despite the diversity of the revolutions, the condition for nonviolent philosophy to succeed at that second stage of constitutionalism is to preserve the joint dynamic of the revolutionaries who brought the dictator down at a time when elections are bound to create competition for power and divisions that weaken the unity achieved in the first stage of the nonviolent philosophy of history. That minimal standard of conviviality is what ties constitution making to the nonviolent spirit that prevails in the revolution. I have examined that proposition, that is the nexus of revolution to constitutionalism through nonviolence, in some detail in the second part of the book. The third constitutive moment for the philosophy of nonviolence is formed by accountability, especially judicial accountability for the members of the fallen regime who have the blood of nonviolent dissidents and unarmed protesters on their hand as the most recent expression of an enduring cruelty coextensive with dictatorship. The central issue, what to do with the Ancien Regime pillars, arises with palpable urgency when the dictator is massively challenged by the revolution. Blood shed by the dictator is a structural component of his system, and his shedding the blood of nonviolent revolutionaries who revolt against him tends to increase during the revolution's last phases. The call for accountability rises markedly in response to the ruler's intensified repression. In the nonviolent philosophy's order of reasons, and I use the order of reasons after a great French philosopher who's not even known enough in his native France, Martial Guéroult, talking about Descartes and the order of reasons, so a certain channeling logically of a set of intellectual propositions. So in the nonviolent philosophy's order of reasons, the question of dictator's criminal behavior and the need to deal with his regime's bloody legacy are important well before the ruler comes tumbling down. As the revolution sets out to remove the dictator without shedding his blood or the blood of those who sustain his system of repression, its vocation, that is the revolution's vocation, gets enmeshed with the expectation to bring the Ancien regime's leading figures and torturers to trial. This makes for the slogan shouted across the Middle East revolution, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام, philosophically at one with the slogan الشعب يريد محاكمة الرئيس, the people want to try the president. This is the subject of the third part of the proposed philosophy of nonviolence in this book. Chronologically, there is some coherence in the succession of the three moments: revolution, constitutionalism, justice. Nonviolent revolution leading to a constitutional process that develops while the accountability for the dictator and his aides gets fulfilled in trials and other processes that come to terms with the violent past. Chronology, however, is not always so tight. International indictments can take place during the revolution. Accountability is made difficult by the flight or death of the rulers. The constitutional moment expands or contracts depending on the political flow of the revolutionary aftermath, and constitution making dovetails with the trials of the dictators and their aides. In the order of reasons, the three moments make sense only as part of the one and same world historic transformation examined as a whole in this book under the prism of nonviolence as philosophy of history. The coherence of the three moments is compelling to the extent the revolution fuses them in a common perception and action as one undivided philosophy. Nonviolence cannot rise to philosophical significance without a coherence that is more than a mindless jacquerie wanting the hated ruler and his corrupt system brought down so that some revolutionaries simply sit in his chair and divide the spoils. So I examine in part 3 of the book the third constitutive moment of the philosophy of nonviolence. We need to consider this judicial moment carefully. Trial means process, procedure. It can always turn meaningless, as in Kafka's celebrated novel, or particularly cruel, as all the trials of dissenters under the dictator. In addition to the pitfalls of Kafkayan and Stalinist trials, the logistics of the establishment of justice, which the dominant literature calls transitional, raises several questions for the Middle East revolution. They are not unique to the Middle East. Like constitutionalism, they raise universal as well as specifically regional and national difficulties. In the book, I take a long route starting with the French Revolution in this part about justice. Transitional justice, quote unquote, was discussed at length in the French Revolution and in all the revolutions where the king and Germain dictators found themselves on trial since Louis XVI. The logistics are important, and what should dwell on the now considerable experience of world revolutions, both violent and non-violent, to distill the constitutive part of justice in a philosophy of non-violence. Should the dictator be tried? When and where? Under which law and by which judge? Would the revolution not lose by cornering him into the promise of a cell for the rest of his life? Should he be indicted before the revolution succeeds? Internationally, what are the consequences of an indictment? What punishment is appropriate? Is the death penalty consonant with the philosophy of nonviolence? Is the dictator to be tried alone? How far down the list of regime pillars and apparatchiks should accountability go? How does the successful revolution organize compensation for his victims? What about corruption and the assets siphoned off during the dictatorship? Are there other alternative or better ways to deal with the bloody past through truth and reconciliation commissions, lustration laws, restitution, and monetary compensation? Can we establish a hierarchy of compensation, the pyramid of accountability, as I call it in one of the chapters in the book? Well, in the third and final part of the journey, like in the previous revolutionary and constitutional moments, answers are sought to all these questions in the light of a universal record that also includes a generally unknown set of Middle Eastern precedents. The various facets of justice as an essential part of nonviolent philosophy are then discussed briefly in a coda that addresses the role of the rest of the world in the search for justice. So here is the general argument in the book, moving through its three moments. There is a general introduction where I try to reinvent a personal philosophy of history that fuses theory and practice. Then in part one, the revolution moves through three chapters. One that has a brief history of nonviolence in the Middle East. Another chapter where the investigation goes through the reconstruction of a humanist culture of nonviolence, which is typically Arab and Middle Eastern. And here certainly, as in the first chapter, the book is very Middle East, Arab specific. And then the third part has really nothing to do with the Middle East, is the examination of what I mentioned as the can't cover paradox, which is the central philosophical paradox that moves us from a revolution which can be nonviolent, absolutely nonviolent, to a government exercising the monopoly of violence, but still inevitably being violent when it exercises it. Then the second part is about constitutionalism, as I mentioned, and here also there is a move through three main chapters after a brief caveat where I argue that a wrong route for the search for constitutionalism is a route that passes through secession. This is an argument which is particularly important nowadays with what's happening in Libya and Yemen and elsewhere. But it is sort of a sideshow to the much more difficult investigation of what makes a constitutional moment a successful one, and indeed one which is premised on nonviolence within the paradox that I delineated. So there's a part where I have to go through the politics of the transition in the Middle East constitutionally. And so there's an examination which I'm sure will be factually challenged by a lot of colleagues of what happened essentially between 2011 and 2014, mainly in the four countries where the dictator was brought down. And then there is a more abstract work on a concept that I delineated as Leshfak. And the short presentation of Leshfak, and it might be a fun moment to try for you to think what does this acronym, the letters in this acronym, stand for. But in effect, it's actually the template that the American Constitution foisted on the constitutional imagination since 1787. Leshfak follows the structure of the American Constitution and boldly argues that we haven't invented anything new in constitutionalism since. And so the 7 parts are L for legislative, that is the people who make the law in the name of the people. the executive, which is the people who apply the law in everyday government, and the judiciary, the people who are exclusively entitled to interpret the law in the case of conflict between either the legislative and the executive, or between other branches of government when you have a federal system like the state, another state, in Arizona and Utah, or the dispute, or indeed, and that's the most important dimension, the protection by the judiciary of the constitutional rights of the citizen or a group of citizens generally designated as minority. So, J is the role of the judiciary, and then F is for federalism. And my argument is that there are countries that can be democratic and operate constitutionally very well without federalism. And that's typically the example of France of the past 200 years. And so the parentheses indicate the unnecessary dimension of federalism. I am constitutionally very supportive of federalism, and that's an argument that I put forward in the book. And the argument goes a bit like this. I think there's perhaps a bit of novelty in a world where novelty is almost impossible, so much has been written on the topic. That federalism and its experience that I lived in Iraq in particular is ill-conceived when the idea is that federalism is the best route to devolution. In a democratic system, mayors are always elected by the people in the village. So it's not so much the issue of the representation of the people in the outskirts, in the periphery, as it is the reinforcement of their power in the center. My example is that the importance of California in the American federal system is not because you have a governor who is elected by the people in California or senators who are elected by Californians. That's not its main and most remarkable addition to democracy. It is actually the power that those two senators have in Washington. So it's much more the voice of the periphery in the center than the voice of the center in the periphery that, in my view, at least as I have argued it over time in the last 2 decades, and in this book in particular, prospectively, for our choice or not of federalism for our countries coming out of dictatorships. And so you'd find it argued in this chapter in particular. So after F, there is, in Leshbach, sorry, I'm getting me dizzy. Here's the table of contents. All right, so you can see part 1, revolution. We're talking about Leshbach and Leshbach's universal template. A is for amendments. Now, this is a bit boring, but when you write a constitution, it's inevitable that you would put in a particular system for amending it. R is for ratification. Again, the constitution gets ratified once, but we are in the face of these always momentous events when either you get a referendum, as in Egypt, and I argue in the book that it's a very bad idea to go through the referendum to approve constitutions, or in a much more telling and persuasive way, you do what the Tunisians did, which is to have the Constituent Assembly that has been elected to write the constitution after a lot of debates, heard on the various arguments, by an enhanced majority. There are other systems that one can think of, but these are the two main goals of intention when it comes to ratification. And then C is what we have in the Bill of Rights. And C is obviously a very decisive dimension of constitutionalism. It is the rights of the citizens under the Constitution, and most importantly, the way one protects them. So, as you can see, it dovetails with justice, because obviously the judges are the people who are designated in the first place for the protection of the constitutional rights of the citizens against usually the forceful and rather heavy interpretation of the executive, or sometimes the legislature passing laws that are fundamentally unconstitutional. So that's a chapter which is very universal, as it were, because my argument is that we have been unable, as constitutional lawyers, to go beyond the separation of powers that Montesquieu put forward in 1748 in the spirit of the laws, and which was enacted most remarkably in the Constitution of 1787. We haven't gone beyond the idea of the law as the expression of the popular will, that is the thought that Rousseau brought in the social contract in 1716, and which you can find inscribed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789 upon the French Revolution. And we haven't gone beyond thought on the arrangements of periphery and center beyond its most sophisticated format, which is federalism. So essentially, we have a very universal template here. And I try to argue at the end of the book, so that people don't get too bored with the chapter, repeating things that have been there for 200 or so years, that we could perhaps think of a new form of constitutionalism moving from, rather than the rulers, moving from society, and thinking perhaps innovation in the form of how would the constitution be written if the focus is not so much the state, but the civil society. So this is an exercise in further political utopia, if you didn't have enough of it this morning. But then the matter which is particularly Middle Eastern is what happens next in the chapter, and in the next chapter, and that is what I call Middle Eastern constitutionalism. And you're most familiar with it. There are two main problems. One is the extraordinary place of religion as a supra-law in our countries, whether it's Judaism for Israel or it's Islam for Muslim countries. So the idea that Islamic law, being as in Article 2 of the Egyptian constitution amended in 1980, as opposed to a reference in the legislation of countries, and in particular of the constitutions. And the second dimension is an even more difficult puzzle to solve, and that is the sectarian system. When citizens, in addition to their allegiance to the state as citizens, in other words, as equal members of a body politic, where between the state and the citizen there is no mediation other than the general concept of equality. Beyond that, when you have citizens who deal with the state not only, but include in a very significant part of their allegiance as members of a given community, particularly in the Middle East, a sectarian community, then how does the principle of majoritarianism that we have inherited from the Leshfar model as an essential part have to accommodate that extraordinarily difficult puzzle that we are, alas, all too familiar with in Iraq, Lebanon, and every single country, including Israel, of course, and in our lifetime and way before. And as the further you go back in Middle Eastern history, the further you realize how sectarian the politics of it has always been. So these are the two parts of Middle Eastern constitutionalism. And then the third part about justice. As I mentioned, it starts actually with, so I read to you the introduction where I'm trying to help the reader recoup after the heavy hits of the previous chapters, and then move on to examine the part of justice which I purposefully restrict outside economic and social rights. So for those of you who are interested in a constitutional horizon which is not formal and which goes beyond the basic liberty, equality principles, then you find nothing in the book. And I apologize for this, but it's a conscious decision because I don't think that, important as they are, these rights are part of the philosophy of nonviolence, at least not as one that I define it. So we are restricted to justice in the form of judicial accountability, mostly for the most important crime, that a philosophy of history exposes, that is the crime of dictatorship. So there's an argument which I cull from a meeting of 40 NGOs in 2004 in Beirut, and then in Cairo, and in Casablanca, and Rabat. So it iterated and produced a very remarkable document where this phrase, dictatorship is a crime against humanity, emerges. And when you come to think of it, I think this is a very major element of a philosophy of history that has elements of novelty. You see, since the 18th century, dictatorship, tyranny, has always been considered a political crime. So you have the right, and it's inscribed in the constitutions, you have the right, sometimes even the duty, to rise up in arms against a tyrannical system to bring down the dictator. What I think the Middle East Revolution in 2011 brings in to that very important dimension is one, that the right to rise violently is replaced by the right, meaning duty, to rise non-violent against a dictator. But for this particular part on justice is that the Middle East Revolution exposes for the first time the necessity of judicial as opposed to political accountability. And so that essential part, which I think I mentioned briefly in the opening talk, that part is comforted by another degree of reality foisted on history by the Middle East when all these NGO groups said, we are taking it to the next level. Any dictator is a criminal against humanity, which means that he must be brought before justice. So you realize how important that contribution of modern Middle Eastern history has been to the discussion. And then I go through, in the next chapter, rediscovery of precedents. Now, of course, there are precedents that are universal. Everybody thinks about Milosevic. But we don't think enough of how important the contribution of the Middle East has been. Dr. Nitri mentioned Sabra and Shatila, but there were other very important cases, including against Bashir before the ICC, against Qaddafi before the ICC, against Qaddafi by the family of Musa Sadr, against Saddam by victims of his large-scale massacres, whether Kurds, Shiis, or plain Iraqis. And I discovered this great moment, which I know our great colleague Leila Fawaz will enjoy in particular, that for the first time actually in history that I could pinpoint as a lawyer as something convincing. The first international tribunals actually took place here in Beirut in 1860 after the massacres in the mountain. And so we have a record of this, which historians, particularly Leila, and to some extent Samir Khalaf, have looked at. But I look at it from the lawyer's lens to see under what rules, what were the rules under which those people who were responsible for the atrocities were tried, because we have some of the records, and we can reconstruct, as this chapter tries to do, that I think quite extraordinary contribution to international criminal law that we saw in our part of the world way back in 1860. And then to be particularly attentive to work which Tariq Mitri did in Libya, there is the pyramid of accountability. So the idea is that you can't try everyone, everybody knows that. So what do? There are a panoply of possibilities, including Lustration Commission. People who have been associated closely with the Ancien regime are barred from seeking political office. And that creates a lot of problems. So much so that in our joint effort to show that the Libyan revolutionaries got it wrong, the UN mission and me, in a footnote, embarked on undermining that law. And as I understand, last week it was repealed. I don't know what you need to replace it. But it's interesting to see that when we talk about timely, there are things that happen as the book gets in our hands that I hope will provide at least a framework for thinking that a bit more clearly, if not more profound. And finally, and that's a chapter which could be a book, but which I purposefully, partly out of being tired, and partly as I try to philosophically explain it. I think revolutions are essentially a domestic matter. So when it comes to foreign intervention, and when you have world historic moments, there are always foreign interventions. But more importantly, if you say that dictatorship is a crime against humanity, then the whole world is tasked with trying the dictator. And so there's an element of internationalism there that I try to address a bit formally in this chapter, and which I'm sure is going to raise a lot of questions, including on the integrity of nonviolence in my philosophy of nonviolence. And the last chapter, I leave it to you to discover. It's trying to open a new window, as if no window had been opened. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed for this most enlightening presentation of your book. We have time for a few questions and answers, please. Couple is fine.
Considering that you're going to consider the crime of dictatorship, first I'd like to know a lot of these definitions which are not being defined. Dictatorship, non-violence, violence, but we can get there. But if the crime of dictatorship is a crime against humanity, what about all the people who fund and maintain and refurbish these dictators, mainly Western European interests? I mean, that's who installed them and maintained them. Therefore, I'm assuming they're also upheld against the crime against humanity, but so it's this idea of it being domestic. I mean, you're arbitrarily just closing the box. You painted the Arab Spring as inspired by the Green Uprising in Iran and the Cedar Revolution, when I personally haven't heard that said from the revolutionaries, although it's possible. But and moreover, you didn't address class at all. The class was just so class, yeah. You painted the picture as a fight against dictatorship, against freedom. It's for freedom. Surely that's an element, but I would hope to argue, or at least see, the fact that most of the people are really, I believe, economically marginalized, and this dictator just stands as the symbolic element in which that grievance is manifested. Finally, your paradox, the Kantian paradox, I didn't see, I'm not sure if I didn't hear it, but I didn't see an answer to the paradox, or I didn't know how you got out of the paradox. So I acknowledge the paradox, but how do you deal with it? Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you. Let's take a couple of more questions and then.
Yes, Tony Ayrut. I understood that actually you consider that military power, religious authorities, and sectarian leaders will not allow the development of rule of law and the separation of power. In your views, what are, other than the international justice, a source for civil society to advance and to promote rule of law?
But I didn't get the beginning. Military dictatorships, religious leaders are what?
Will not allow the development of rule of law and will not respect the separation of power.
Okay, yeah.
So in your views, what are the tools and what are the possibilities for civil society to advocate for these values?
Joe, hello. I would like to know, depending on the presentation so far, how expansive is the process of constitutionalism? So, meaning, how does constitutionalism, specifically in the Middle East or on a global level, truly reflect the political, sociological, and economic challenges and conditions of society? Does it reflect those conditions, or does the Constitution at certain points get imposed from above, sort of like an elitist arrangement on the people, and then that is what really leads to a sort of clash between the people it governs and the system as well. I would like some clarification. Thank you.
Right, great questions, thank you. On definitions, I have a sort of a cop-out statement at the beginning where I'm saying, if you're talking democracy, good governance, rule of law, transparency, I'm fine with those. There's a sort of a general idea that sets dictatorship as opposed to democracy. And you can more or less fine-tune it because things can be in gray in many ways. No doubt democracy is always perfectible. You can always say that short of, for instance, ensuring economic rights, the system is not democratic. But I'm, in that sense, old hat. But I'm old hat philosophically in the sense that I don't think the philosophy of history that we are seeing is one where, in particular to your second questions, the issue of class is important. That the causality of the revolution is defined by class in significant part is obvious. I think our colleague Gilbert Achar wrote a very good book on this, showing the frustration, when 50% of the youth can't find a job. There is no doubt that they're being more prone to going down in the street to get back their dignity. And so, you have a penumbra of causes that you can never pinpoint because people are moved also by several causations. But in the work, I purposefully, philosophically set it aside by saying that's not the condition of nonviolence. It might explain the revolution. But what I'm interested in particular, is why is the revolution nonviolent? And I don't think class has much to offer on this. And other causes might not. So I'm more interested in the nonviolent characteristic of the revolution. And just for a definition, I think I said it, nonviolence for me is the way to advance one's political interests and ambitions without shedding blood. Now, of course, as all definitions, it always falls short of a reality which is more complex, but that's a working proposal. It has to battle against economic violence. It has to battle against domestic violence. These are topics that you will not find in the book. I defend that choice philosophically, but I might be wrong. So colleagues who've read the book in its manuscript phase were not happy to see the sort of ignorance of particularly interesting anthropological and psychoanalytic literature on violence. But partly because I don't know enough to feel comfortable in it. But because I think I'm trying to move here on a level of political philosophy where the personal, individual dimension is perceived only in terms of a much larger group. So that helps me avoid the pitfalls of personal brain tuning on, say, why is a revolutionary in the street. And the Cedar and the Green Revolution may not be appealing to a number of revolutionaries in the street. The reason why people take to the streets are varied, And what I'm arguing is that objectively, there is a characteristic thread that starts with the Cedar Revolution, where purposefully, when we were in the street, we were very keen not to do damage to anyone, including the policemen and the government apparatus. And the same thing was in the Green Revolution. But I accept that the reasons why people take to the street are varied and I think actually impossible to fathom. And on the cover paradox, it's a difficult part of the book. And so I look forward to you reading it more carefully to see how it holds. I tried to adumbrate some of it in my opening talk. And that is, there are two ways to solve the paradox. One is in time. And the idea is that a revolution can be nonviolent, and the state afterwards has to be violent. But will be violent within the constraints of the rule of law in a democratic society. So this is the most extraordinary reality that has been decreed upon us in 2011, is this phenomenal rejection of violence against the repressive agencies of the state, including the dictator. And to that extent, I think it's really an extraordinary phenomenon in history that you have to take account to. And that is actually the origin of the book, which is, there's a phenomenon there that we need to account for philosophically, of course politically and sociologically, but philosophically is a strong moment for it. And of course the travails of the revolutions are such that people, had I told you this in April or May 2011, you would be much readier to accept it than I'm telling you now with what is happening in Yemen or what has happened in Syria. So that's in terms of the solving the paradox in time sequence. But I think I try to think of it as solving it in nature by adding actually that third part, which is judicial part. You see, the revolutionaries don't forego their right to violence. They don't forego their right to the revenge. Actually, that violence and revenge against the dictator is very much part of the revolution. But it's just suspended. And if I say that the trial of the dictator is very much part of a one philosophy of nonviolence, then obviously I have to make room in the revolution for some anticipation of that moment. To that extent, you can't solve the paradox, because the paradox is inevitably that when revolutionaries come to power, they want accountability for their peers, themselves, the victims of the dictator. And that accountability is very much part of the philosophy of nonviolence. On what can we do about the military dictatorships and the religious leaders who are hijacking our revolution to re-establish a system of authoritarianism that put them in the lead. So essentially, the two main challenges to the revolution in the Middle East since 2011, and which continue and which have won their way in Egypt for the military dictatorship, and in Libya certainly, and Syria as I see it from the religious, not necessarily leadership, but the religious movements that are using Islam as a tool to take over violently the revolution. These are relatively practical matters. I don't go into that too much because you have to go into the details of what you do on the street and how do you deal with this, how do you anticipate it, and I don't have a ready answer, frankly. What is certain is that I can recognize Sisi to be dictator, and that's certainly not what the revolution wants. Now, how could the revolution have avoided Sisi is a very complex issue that I deal with partly through the constitutional process. See, the reason why I think it failed in Egypt is in large part because the constitutional unity was not preserved. In other words, that the groups that made the revolution were too easily divided by elections. So one of the strong moments of the book, I think, is the statement, elections wreck revolutions. In other words, they undermine the revolutionary unity, and that allows to either people from the former regime or for hijackers of the religious of military persuasion to more easily take over the state. But I don't have, I admit, a satisfying answer to these challenges that you raise in your question. The very interesting question about how expansive the process of constitutionalism, there's no doubt that this book is undermined by my own very narrow lens of a jurist. And I'm sure sociologists, political scientists, international relations people, psychologists, anthropologists will have a hard time understanding why I focus so much on the constitutional process. I think there's a degree of reality, which is that every single country that comes out of dictatorship is is driven by redrawing the social contract, and that's what we call a constitution. So it becomes a focus of the revolution immediately? How do you express it other than in this extraordinary debate where liberty is there to voice your opinions and try to couch the rules that will allow this opinion to continue, and the choice of the leadership in government to be done without the shedding of blood? These are very difficult questions, but they are all looked at in the book from the canopy of the Constitution, because I think it's a comfortable and convincing canopy that is perhaps too expansive and not subtle enough. I never thought that the Constitution was a matter that should obscure the very real political process that is taking place. We are talking about a political process of contentious interests and very heartfelt feelings and visions of the world and so forth, who are battling it out. But I think the prospect of the Constitution is what brings those together in a non-violent sequel of the revolution. So that's the argument about the Constitution, but I'm not one who ever thought that reading the Constitution will tell you how the country is ruled. Tariq is telling me that I didn't answer the civil society part in your question. Actually, I'm trying to do it. Your question is very difficult. So how do you avoid Islamists taking over with their brand of Islam, which is profoundly violent? Or how do you prevent Sisi from taking over in Egypt? And what does civil society do in that? Civil society in that sense is one, this is where issues of definition come in. Generally, I think of civil society, and I try to give pointers to what I find the best works on this extraordinarily, talk about expansive topic. And the idea for me of civil society, you can't think of civil society outside the state. In other words, by definition, civil society operates vis-a-vis the state. And once we have acknowledged this, it becomes a little bit easier. It's obviously civil society that's doing the revolution. It's the most extraordinarily wide expression of civil society in the street that topples a dictator. Now, how it does it with to avoid the takeover of religious extremists or of the military, or really great danger is the return of the old regime in new forms, that is just the same people minus the dictator. Then we go back to the first answer. There is a panoply of practical and political issues that we have to be careful about, mostly by preserving the unity of the revolution as much as possible. So the device is going to be, how do you create the processes where the revolution remains as much as possible after the fall of the dictator, one.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I realize that you've been trying to establish a general framework to understand the revolutions in the Arab world, but allow me to be a bit selfish and bring you back to Lebanon. Where does Lebanon fit in the spectrum that you have established? And in terms of non-violence, the Cedar Revolution was kind of a success, but its aftermath is a failure, as we can see now. What is your opinion on the saying that Lebanon is a dictatoria tawafuqiyya, or a consensual dictatorship? And what is, in your opinion, the best way to get out of such a dictatorship installed by sectarianism, a dictatorship on Lebanese citizenship? Thank you.
Can you please ask me less difficult questions?
Professor Haidar. Oh, no.
I mean, it's obviously a very sophisticated argument for revolution in general and pre and post-revolution. But let me go back to the violence aspect. I mean, if you talk about philosophy of non-violence, we think contrasting it to the philosophy of violence, where the claim is that violence is necessary, kind of Fanonian or some Marxian, right? That this is necessary for purging. If you're arguing against that, that's an easy target in some sense. because we have seen that some non-violent revolutions do work. The question is if you're making a more strong claim, which is that you can always do it non-violently, and that violence is never a necessary option. Here, where the people like Locke will disagree with you, that taking up arms against dictators sometimes is necessary for. After all, even the American Revolution, which came up with all these, is an armed revolution. It wasn't the non-violent one against the British rule and against the non-democratic system. So, in that sense, to what extent one can say that you are arguing for a non-violence, or that you're simply saying that there's a non-violent possibility if the circumstances line up together to make it possible, but they might not line up together. And they might not line up together in many cases. Some of them is foreign intervention, but some of them is also internal problems, when the dictator is allied by a particular community. And therefore, non-violence cannot appeal to the army to not actually take harsh actions. Then you can, it's not like the army will feel it cannot kill its own people because it's actually not their own people. They are some other communities. And that's one aspect where you can actually justify, it's the only way you can do it is through violence. I'm not sure where you stand on this. You see that non-violence is a possibility or is it a necessity for successful revolution? Thank you.
Follow-up to my colleague's question. A lot of the theories of non-violence, when you consider Rawls or King, Rawls, John Rawls or King, is that it should take place in a well-ordered society. There's a sense of justice, a consciousness of justice. In the Middle East, that is lacking in some places. There is a preference for a negative peace. So we prefer order over justice. So where does your theory fit into that?
Thank you again for a wonderful question. Well, you see, the revolution is, in my argument, a failed revolution and a successful one. Its success, actually, under the standards that I developed in the book, appear both in the removal of a form of dictatorship, which was Syrian domination, but the failure of removing Lahoud as the essence of dictatorship expressed at the head of the state. So I think there was a major problem. I was just talking with Tariq. I was very conscious about from the beginning of the revolution that without the removal of the symbol at the head of the executive of dictatorship, the revolution was going to fail. The dimension of judicial accountability is actually also very interesting. So one of the main planks of the Cedar Revolution was what iterated into the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. But we've seen, 10 years after our Prime Minister was killed so ignominiously, we still don't have arrests. So there's a problem there. And I go a little bit through this in the book, but in our conversation, if I were to focus on Lebanon, that was a major failure. And then we can discuss why it was a major failure. Was it because of Ramets? Was it because the tribunal was structurally incapable of doing something to bring justice to the victims? And what was failing certainly was there was no concept in the revolution of a new social contract. And that I think was a major failure of us revolutionaries in the Civil Revolution. So, a bit of failure and a bit of success. But certainly the most important dimension is ushering in nonviolent power. Nonviolent power is ineffective. Now, I think you're asking me also about consensual dictatorship. I don't believe in a word like this. I think it's stretching oxymorons too much and paradoxes too much. There is a sectarian system which I'm trying to take seriously, saying that majoritarian constitutionalism has been unable to provide for minorities. And I actually found a wonderful text in Tocqueville's Democracy in America. You see, especially at an American university, You know, I think that actually Tocqueville despised the American system. And there's a chapter at the end of the first volume of Democracy in America. As you know, it came out in 2 big volumes in 1835 and 1840. And the last chapter of the first volume is called Les Trois Races, the Three Races. And he shows how the democratic system of America, what the democratic system of America did to the second race, which was the blacks, and the third race, which was the natives. So enslaving the blacks and exterminating the natives. So from that, it's hard to think that that extraordinary person that is Tocqueville, and the whole hullabaloo that goes until now by putting him on a pedestal, was actually defender of the democratic system, which he saw in America. And so to that extent, this is a real problem, and a real problem that continues to date in Ferguson and elsewhere, which is a majoritarian system has a very complicated responsibility in keeping minorities at bay. And so the sectarian system in Lebanon is, in some ways, one that has prevented dictatorship, because there is a limit that a sect is allowed to suffer collectively by the other sects in the name of democracy. And that's why I'm saying you can't get out of it that easily, because even in a sophisticated constitutional system, the experience that we have with majoritarian democracy, including when a democracy has guards like the very strong judiciary in the United States, the legacy of 200 years is not a benign one. And so I don't have an answer. I think as a constitutional lawyer, I have been unable over 30 years of struggling with a system that I despised, which is the system straitjacketed by sectarianism, where you become president just because you are Maronite. I find it really stupid and demeaning for Maronites themselves. But it's not easy to get out of it when you put it in the larger frame. I suggest a few things. You'll see in the book, but you won't have a definitive answer. Professor, your wonderful questions. No, nonviolence, if I trouble myself with the 3 years, which are hopefully the result of the 20 years of thinking, of putting forward a philosophical system, then I don't think of it as, that is, nonviolence, or philosophy of nonviolence as a possibility, but as a necessity. It is a philosophical necessity. And you're right, it starts with an easy target. Violence as the midwife of history is that famous sentence that Engels ascribes to Marx. And so, and it is found, and it's actually inscribed in the resistance to tyranny. The resistance to tyranny has the right to take up arms against a dictator. And sometimes a duty. You'll find it in the Declaration of Independence of the United States. And that's still the law. And talking about Arab and Middle Eastern, there's a very rich tradition of the jurists in classical Islam that are struggling with this. It's also a problem that Aquinas is struggling. So it's when the ruler is flouting the law, and at that time it was the divine law, aren't you bound to rise against him to defend the divine law? And so it's not a new question, but the answer has always been, yes, you have, for those who support it, you must do it, and you have the right to use violence. What I think happens in 2011, and of course it's not only the Middle East, it's the legacy of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, but it's most extraordinary in the Middle East, I think, because there is so much violence in the Middle East, that people would come in the millions to topple dictatorships that are 3-4 decades old by consciously choosing a non-violent matter. That cannot be a possibility. It must be a need. Now, to be a little bit less flowery in my enthusiasm for non-violence, I will grant that the situation can be extremely difficult. And that's what we have in the Syrian situation. So for 5 months, systematically, there's non-violence in the street. I mean, non-violence. absolute extraordinary nonviolence. And in Ramadan of 2011, the Syrian revolution starts to militarize. Intuitively at the time, and now after the book, in a way which I will defend tooth and nail, politically and philosophically, that was the moment when the Syrian revolution lost. And so, you tell me what, they don't have a choice, you know, he's been shooting at them systematically and killing them systematically, so the army split and the Free Syrian Army formed and they took up arms to defend their king. Right? That's what happened. But you see, it was not necessarily bound to happen. Actually, when it happened, it played right in the hands of Assad, transforming the revolution into civil war, especially playing on the sectarian card. Retrospectively, I'd say, I wish the revolution had stopped in July 2011. Regrouped, we weren't able to remove Assad. Let's not turn violent. And for those skeptics who tell me you're living in cuckoo land, I tell you, well, it's exactly what happened in Bahrain. In Bahrain, the revolution did not militarize. And that guy brought in the troops of the Saudis and the others to quell the revolution, and he did. Violently, brutally, it was extraordinary. And continued to be extraordinary violence against the people in Bahrain, the dissidents. For, 3.5 years now, they did not take up the weapons. And you can always tell me, yes, because it's overwhelming and so forth, but that's not. There's something about it which is quite extraordinary in Bahrain. So, the ultimate position is, the revolution is, if we're talking about a new philosophy of history, then we have to talk about the necessity of that moment, of that historic moment, when nonviolence replaces violence as the midwife of history, to take up Marx' terms. Rules. And, you know, I don't think rules, it depends what book you're talking about. If you're talking about
theory of justice,
if it's theory of justice, it doesn't deal that much with non-audit society. He takes audit society as a basis. I think the law of peoples is where he puts all these four categories of well-ordered and less ordered. I don't think the law of people is the best of Rawls' book. I take from Rawls quite a few things in the examination of the constitutional part. He didn't deal very much with the judicial accountability when it comes to dictators, because his main frame of investigation is Western society, where the Middle East or Chinese dictator is not his concern. So it's a different purpose that Rawls
but to him,
has.
the reason it's successful, the reason nonviolence is successful, is because there is a sense of justice in the community. So when you want to come compare to the Middle East, where the sense of justice may be lacking, where there may be a preference for order over justice, that's, I guess, the question of the effectiveness of nonviolence.
Well, look, you're right, but you see, I think we're still thinking Middle East despondently. I mean, you tell Yemenis, who in each family have 2 sets of weapons, so who come down the streets for 5, 6 straight months against Ali Abdullah Saleh without shooting one weapon. You tell me they're responding to order as opposed to justice? I'd say there's a degree of reality there that we should adjust to, and not the opposite. I think there is something extraordinary that we learned from those revolutions. You know, the guy in the street in Yemen, it was way ahead of us, who are questioning whether we use violence. He chose non-violence systematically, and there are millions like this in the Yemeni streets. The poorest and probably most economically and socially backward country in the Middle East. So I think we should readjust our perception of defining Middle East society in terms of order.
I have a footnote, if I may, regarding your reference to the Middle Eastern political culture that is more concerned about order as over any injustice. I think Chibli did a great job by inviting us in his book, though in only a few pages, to retrieve Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi's work. I think Kawakibi sort of breaks away with a political culture that is averse to dissent and is obsessive about fitna, about sedition. And in his Tabail Istibdad, he just makes it possible for us to look to change the hierarchy, as it were, of public values that regulate our societies. So, unfortunately, Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi doesn't have many followers today, but it's good to go back to people like him. And
one of the fun chapters talking about Arab subject, more specific subject of the book, beyond the presence of the book, is the chapter on chatted political language. I think many of you will find it amusing, if not curious, because I tried to retrieve that humanist tradition of which Kawakibi in 1901, when Tabail Istibdad is serialized, writes, الاستبداد لا يقاوم بالعنف. I mean, what more theory of nonviolence applied to dictatorship? Now, it'd be interesting to revisit Kawakibi because a lot of him have seen a socialist dimension in Kawakibi. So Mustafa Sibai and others saw sort of a combination of Islam and socialism, which was fashionable in the 70s. I'm trying to make Kawakibi fashionable from the nonviolent perspective, but also people like Mutanabbi and people like Abu Ala and the philosophers like Mullah Sadra. So there is a little bit of investigation there to footnote the footnote of Professor Mitri that I hope you will like.
more questions?
These terms like order, stability, these are like essentialist. It's a totally essentialist. Excuse me. You can't just put this label of the Middle East and say they're ordered or justice as if there's some unified, monolithic culture. This reminds us of like Huntingtonian mentalities. So anyone who looks into the history would realize the immense diversity of these kind of notions and the immensely diverse interpretations of these notions. But you didn't answer my question about whether Europeans and Americans could be held for a crime against humanity,
yes, you're right.
since that's
That's an important question.
and I feel like Dr. Haidar's argument was slightly kind of sidetracked. I mean, I understand the principle of nonviolence, and we can all agree that it works and it can work. But do you really feel what you're essentially saying is that you'd rather people you'd rather them live in an enslaved condition versus fighting for their freedom? Given that they cannot attain it in a non-resistant, non-violent manner, you would you tell those people to consent to their indignification, dehumanization, and so forth. And I think the whole point of violent resistance, as Fanon once argued and others, and if you look at the history of imperialism, I mean, almost every single continent rose up violently, from China to India, and eventually non-violently too. I'm not here putting more weight, but isn't it a tactical consideration fundamentally? Thank you.
Ryan, that would be the last question.
Can you hear me? Okay. Maybe because it's the last question, try to end it on a more positive note, and in some sense it's at the heart of your book, and that's the Tunisian experience, especially when we're talking about constitutionalism and their ability to negotiate, all the other issues that the others weren't able to. So do you look at it in that way as a model? Do you comment about the experiences of Tunisia?
Right. Thank you again for two very critical points. Look, role of the West in the Middle Eastern set of dictatorships is one nobody is going to deny. There is a problem of causality. In other words, who is responsible for our societies, ourselves or the West? Now, you can always make the argument that the West has so much power economically and otherwise that they also are responsible for it. And I think it's true. And I'm not one who would necessarily oppose some sort of an action against the collusion of Western leaders with the system of dictatorship. It'd be interesting, but the problem is that we aren't even starting domestically. So in the order of reasons, of responsibilities, I would be reluctant to think, but there are occasions. So I have no doubt I'd like to see Mr. Kissinger tried for the Pinochet takeover. I'm not, I think that comes with it. And there are elements of the corporate responsibility that are now being actioned, not with great success, not enough success, I think, but this is a horizon that's worth pursuing. But I think it's within the logic of the book. As to the choice, the right to take up arms violently to defend oneself, there's no purpose to the book if I were to acquiesce to it. That's the law. I can tell you that's the law. The law is one that cannot consider you to be in abeyance if you take up arms. But I'm trying to push, if the book is serious, we're trying to talk seriously about a paradigmatic shift in the philosophy of history that is introduced by nonviolence. We can talk about the tactics and so forth, but I think that we have to protect the integrity of that midwife, nexus, or what I call at the end of the book, anima, that is defined by nonviolence. And on the positive note, we've had, Ari and I and all of us, so many setbacks in our expectations over the years, and we're still at it. So I think there is quite a lot of resilience, even in the darkest hours of what's happening in Egypt today. There is resilience amongst our colleagues in Egypt, and for us, nobody is going to make us applaud Sisi. We recognize him for what he is, a petty dictator of the Mubarak and probably worse type, because he didn't have the intelligence of Mubarak of spreading his violence out over 30 years. And Tunisia, of course, is a positive, still critical. I mean, when you see this 89-old character called Sipsi being president, you get a bit of disappointment. But yes, the book deals with the Tunisian experiment constitutionally. And also judicially. I think there is a big, going back to this, what is Ben Ali doing in Saudi Arabia, and why is the Saudi king protecting Ben Ali? He should be released to the justice of the Tunisian courts, or if they don't believe in a Tunisian court, of international court that is set up to deal with Ben Ali and his legacy of 30 years of brutality. And so we fight. And one thing that is, I have 2 lines of defense in the book, which are both cop-outs, but they go alongside the optimism that you're advocating. One is in the work on Kant's treaty on perpetual peace, which is the basis of the paradox. I found out that actually Kant is dealing with a genre that started with a guy called Abbé de Saint-Pierre, who was a diplomat mediating the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. So there is some fun part where I'm suggesting that actually we're wrong. The nation state emerges in 1713 in Utrecht, not in Westphalia in 1648. But this will be controversial. But what is not controversial is that the first person on earth who writes a project for perpetual peace, and that's the title of Kant's essay in 1795, is the Abbé de Saint-Pierre in 1712, the first such document to appear. And it's remarkable. It's an extraordinary text. Now, when it appeared, everybody made fun of him. And what, you really think that that you're going to have perpetual peace. And so there is a very amusing making fun of the Abbé de Saint-Pierre for this utopian image, which when is taken up by Kant becomes the foundation, I think, with all due respect to the international relations colleagues here, foundation of what is known as the democratic peace, which is the foundation of every single system of international relations that is not purely realistic. In other words, that countries do not go to war against each other if they are democratic. That's all in Kant. But a lot of Kant was already in the Abbé de Saint-Pierre. And I studied this through the iterations of Rousseau's comments on the Abbé. That is probably what led to Kant in the 18th century. And so the line of defense is to say, well, what's the date today? 2015. The project of the Abbé was in 1713. Give me 300 years and then we'll discuss the book. But a more serious line of defense is that I never think, and that's in the beginning of the book, what we have in the Middle East in 2011 is an extraordinary tsunami. And we have a precedent to judge it by. It's called the Atlantic Revolution. So Robert Palmer and Jacques Godchaud coined this phrase in the mid-20th century to account for an extraordinary phenomenon that is not taking place just in the French Revolution, just in the American Revolution, just in the Netherlands. It is an extraordinary phenomenon that convulses the world from approximately 1775 to 2010, 2020. And that's why it needs a new concept, which is called the Atlantic Revolution. That's why I'm not that interested just in Lebanon or in Egypt or in Tunisia. I think we have a concept which we should call the Middle East Revolution, preferably the Middle East Nonviolent Revolution. And that is 3-4 decades. At least a generation is needed to appreciate what's happening. So, in 2015 we have Tunisia. Next year Tunisia might have receded, but we might have progresses elsewhere. Sisi, I can assure you, will be weaker next year. So, this is a phenomenon that you have to look at, I think, within a much larger span of time than 1 year or 2 or 4.
Thank you very much, Professor Mallat. Thank you all. Those of you...
There are only 10 books, and please don't feel obliged to buy any of them. And if those who are interested can just leave their email and name at the table.